Good morning, guys. With all this craziness, I thought that I would try to read you guys a story and send you a chapter each day. I love history, so we're going to start with a book about George Washington. This is from the Heroes of America series. Chapter 1 is called A Virginia Boyhood. "Hang on, George, hang on there, boy," Lawrence Washington shouted. The young man was sitting on a fence, watching his little 7-year-old half-brother as the youngster bucked and bounced in the saddle of the unbroken horse he had determined to train by himself. George bit his lip, clutching at the reins. He forced his long, strong legs around the horse's flank, digging his heels into the underbelly and holding on for dear life. He was very strong for a 7-year-old. Because even for wealthy families like the Washingtons, who had slaves to do most of their work for them, life in colonial America was hard and active and lived mainly in the rugged outdoors. It was more than 2 hours since George had thrown his saddle over the horse's back, and still the animal struggled with all its might, trying to throw its young rider. But George was even more determined. He had announced that he would break this headstrong animal, and break it he would. Suddenly the horse dropped to the ground. Its knees buckled as it went down. George sprang away quickly to keep from being thrown, or worse, crushed underneath. Lawrence jumped down from the fence and raced across the pasture. "George, are you all right?" he asked, kneeling down to where the young rider was sprawled on the grass. "What happened?" "He didn't throw me," George answered defiantly. "I jumped when I felt him going down." George rubbed his scraped elbows and knees. "Why did he do that, I wonder?" Lawrence muttered. Satisfied that George wasn't seriously hurt, Lawrence turned his attention to the horse. "He's dead," Lawrence said in amazement, almost to himself. He turned back to his half-brother. "He just gave up," he said. "But you didn't, did you, George?" George tried to smile, but he was still hurting a little too much for that. "No, I didn't," he said proudly. "I never give up." Lawrence smiled at those words. He squeezed his stepbrother's shoulder playfully. Although Lawrence was 15 years older and one of the sons of their father's first marriage, he and George were great friends. By the way, guys, the horse wasn't really dead. George liked nothing more than to stay at Lawrence's estate, Epswasson. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, so let me spell it for you. Epsewasson. It was both an escape from the constant gaze of his mother Mary and a wonderful place for a boy to grow up. There were deep forests to wander in, to look for animals who made their homes in and under the thickly growing trees. There were meadows for catching insects in, small brooks, and the great Potomac River to fish in. Horses and dogs and farmyard creatures were pets. For George, Epsewasson was his home away from home and very nearly heaven on earth. In later life, when it indeed became George's home, it was known as Mount Vernon. Today, it is a landmark for all Americans. For now, though, home for George was the family farm, big enough to be considered a plantation, near a town called Fredericksburg. The town was where he went to school. Home was called Ferry Farm. It was not home only to George, of course, but to his parents, Mary and Augustine, and George's 3 younger brothers and sister Elizabeth. George's older half-brother, Austin, was in school in England at this time. England was where the Washington family had come from. to this great new wilderness of Virginia. Virginia was a colony of England's, ruled by what the colonists called the mother country. George's great-grandfather, John Washington, had been the first of their line to make the dangerous ocean voyage to the New World. George's grandfather and father had been born here, as had George himself, though no one knows exactly when. The Washington Family Bible lists George's birth date as February 11, 1731. But a great change was made in the calendar when George was about 20 years old. When the calendar changed, the date of his birth became February 22nd, 1732. Just as England, the mother country, ruled the 13 colonies, Mary Washington ruled the family at Ferry Farm. Although George was her oldest child, she treated him more like a baby than she did the younger ones. Maybe it was just that she worried about him more, but George didn't see it that way. To him, it was a never-ending battle between what he wanted to do and what his mother would allow. Even school was easier than their constant squabbles. George did well at his lessons. Even school was easier than their constant squabbles. George did well at his lessons. His teacher, the Reverend Mr. James Meyer, taught the dozen or so children in his charge the sort of practical things they would need to know as grown-ups in the new world. But at the same time, the teacher wanted them to behave like future ladies and gentlemen. Lessons in conduct were very important, and George learned rules of cleanliness and behavior that stayed with him all his life. It was by memorizing proverbs or sayings that children were taught in those days. One of the ideas that stayed with George was, "Undertake not what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise." George paid a lot of attention to this and to all of his lessons. He studied very hard and worked on his lessons until they were perfect. Even his 3 playful little brothers could not distract him. His studies soon became more important than playing. He often seemed lonely even in the midst of a big and active family. Here's a picture that they illustrated of his 3 little brothers. George was ready to read the books in Lawrence's large library, but now something serious interfered. Lawrence had to leave Epswasson to join the army. George was very proud of his older brother. He thought Lawrence was a hero, but he was worried. Lawrence might be injured or killed because Great Britain, as England is also called, had declared war on Spain. It was known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. What a strange name for a war, George thought. It started because Spain had colonies in Central and South America, just as England did in North America. The Spanish Coast Guard tried to stop British ships from trading with the Spanish colonies and taking profits that Spain wanted all for herself. The war got its name when a Spanish Coast Guardsman cut off the ear of a British sea captain named Robert Jenkins. The British Army recruited an American regiment for an attack on Cartagena?
This is Cartagena.
I'm going to have to look that up. So Shell, Edward, Margaret, somebody look that up and tell me how to pronounce it, please. A port in Colombia, South America. The city was rumored to be a storehouse of Spanish treasure. "I have been commissioned as an officer of the American regiment," Lawrence announced to his family. "My men will sail from Chesapeake Bay to join Admiral Vernon's fleet in Jamaica. From there, it's on to Colombia." "We will pray for your safety, of course," said Augustine Washington, but I wish you would change your mind and stay out of the war." "Please don't go," pleaded George, hugging his brother with all his might, as if holding him very tightly would prevent him from leaving. Disaster, not treasure, awaited the British Army. "There's been a terrible defeat," said the sailors in Fredericksburg, returning from the British West Indies with the latest news. The British Army lost a great number of fighters. And the American regiment? Nobody knew. Many weeks passed before a letter arrived at Ferry Farm. Was it a notice of Lawrence's death? Augustine Washington's hand trembled so much as he unsealed the envelope that he didn't even notice that the address was in Lawrence's handwriting. "The regiment is being disbanded now. I'll be home soon," Lawrence wrote it. "Hooray!" George shouted. He had feared that he might never see his beloved half-brother again. Here's a picture of George shouting, "Hooray!" There was a double homecoming for the Washington family. Lawrence returned from the war, and Austin came home from school in London. It was wonderful for the whole family to be reunited. They sat around the dinner table and talked for hours. Lawrence told them about the war, and Austin talked about Appleby, his English school. George hoped to go to both the Army and to Appleby when he got older. "I have some news too," George's father announced. "I read in the Virginia Gazette that Colonel William Fairfax, one of the richest and most important men in the colony of Virginia, has just bought the land next to Epswasson." "By the way," Lawrence announced, "I have decided to change the name of my plantation from Epswasson to Mount Vernon, in honor of Admiral Vernon." While the elder Washingtons kept track of all the new settlers in the colony of Virginia, George concentrated on his schoolwork. He studied geography, history, Greek, and Latin, but his favorite subject was math. "Look what I found," George said to his father one evening. They were looking through some of the things in the storage sheds on Ferry Farm. He held up a compass, a ruler, and lots of other things that he couldn't identify. "Those are my surveying tools," Augustine Washington replied. "They are used to measure a plot of land and draw a map with boundaries. If you buy land, you can write in the deed exactly how many acres it contains and where it begins and ends." "There are so many tools," George said. "Is it difficult to be a land surveyor?" "Not really," his father answered. "You just have to do some mathematical calculations. By the time you finish school, you should know enough math to be able to do the job." "I think that would be a very interesting profession," George declared. But history had a far different career in store for George Washington. Here's a picture of him and his father, or an illustration. This is not actually a picture of them. And that is the end of chapter 1. When we come back, we'll read chapter 2, which is called Growing Pains.